I am so excited to say, welcome back to the Center for Geospatial Analytics. It's been a number of years since the forum's been away from the main labs and teaching spaces of the center, but we're here now. So thanks for joining us for the first run of our experiment coming back. We'll be doing things a little different, so that's hopefully be very fun, connected to our space, a little more casual right here in kind of the main living room of our research and teaching labs. I want to give a special big shout out thanks to Zach Acaro, our new producer of the forum, who's going to be providing a very tailored recording experience, not just for us here, but for everybody online joining the forum as well. And of course, John and others for always being there, making this happen. And Lois and Rachel in the back, always giving us great food. And Eric, always making this happen as well. Sure, I left some people out. Anyways, I'm not going to take any more time. Just so excited we're here. I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Ashley to introduce our guest today.
Hello, everyone. Excited is the word for today. I'm Ashley Cawas. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering. I'm also a fellow here, and I'm excited and honored to be introducing an amazing colleague and a friend today for the Geospatial Forum. Dr. Eleni Bardaka is an associate professor as well in our department, and her work focuses on two main research areas. First, the study of causal, social, and economic impacts of transportation investments and policies, and the analysis of aggregate and individual travel demand preferences and needs related to public transportation and micromobility. She has 2 degrees in transportation engineering, PhD, and MS from Purdue University, and importantly, and something that I think brings very novel perspectives to her research, a master's degree in economics, and she earned a 5-year diploma in civil engineering at the National Technical University of Athens in Greece. With this, I hope that you enjoy her presentation and learn a lot from her. I know I'm excited to hear from her.
Thank you, Dr. Habas. All right. Thank you all for coming today. So I wanted to start with a little bit about me. So I'm still getting used to the room and the screen next to me, but no, it's an amazing space. Just a little bit new to me. So I started in Greece as a civil engineer, and I moved to the US to do my master's and PhD. At some point during my PhD, I met a professor who eventually became my co-advisor for my PhD, and he was teaching a course in spatial econometrics. And at the time, I wasn't really aware of that field, but some of my friends were taking the class, so I wanted to join them. So that's the level of maturity, okay, at that time in my life. So I remember while I was sitting in that class and we were talking about different spatial relationships, and my mind was going in different places. At the time, I was doing research related to highway asset management because that's what my advisor had funding on for me to do. And really like dragging myself to do the PhD because I was not passionate about the work I was doing. I was gradually realizing the importance of having to love what you do to do it well. Something that I didn't learn from my family because my parents didn't learn that from their parents, and because they were trying to survive World War II. And so loving what you do was not really the #1 thing in everybody's mind then. And so my parents never told me do something that you love. They said, do something that will help you have a living, make a living, or not need others to survive. So anyway, while sitting in that class, I started thinking about topics in economics, topics that have to do with spatial interactions and transportation. And the idea was popping in my mind that we know so much about how transit impacts property prices, but what happens to the people? I remember really sitting there with that question. Has there been studies about when these new large projects happen, what happens in the neighborhoods around them, what happens in the businesses, apart from just the prices, which I know it was something studied for decades and decades. And that was about 10 years ago. And at the time, really, there was maybe a couple of studies related to what eventually became the focus of my research, which is about socioeconomic impacts in areas close to urban rail and urban rail stations. So that's one of the things I do. And at the same time, the other line of my work, which I will not be discussing today, has to do with travel behavior and new emerging mobility systems, how people use them, experience them, and how disadvantaged users feel about them and experience them. And you can ask me other things about that or more specific questions about that if you have questions later. But yeah, I'll be focusing on this angle of my research in this presentation. So we know that a lot of billions have been spent on urban rail infrastructure in this country. And you may have heard the term transit-oriented development, which is about creating these communities, or at least it was conceived as creating communities around stations, those communities being walkable, those communities being inviting to people who want to use public transportation. But what ends up happening is that we see a lot of these high-end, very expensive properties and people moving there that don't use public transportation. And at some point, I did a survey of the people who live in those types of properties, and most of them still drive to work and other places they go to. So, so what we know so far is that in general, not everywhere, but in many places, property prices will go up around these areas, and that may have some impacts. And there is a level of gentrification going on that in many cases have been caused by those investments happening in those neighborhoods. And it's not just the inner city gentrification that happens in general in those cities. Some of the questions that remain not very well answered is what happens to low-income households, and is there really displacement because the one does not always equal the other? And what happens to businesses? We really don't know what happens to businesses, and there is not much on the policy side about protecting businesses. And I think it has to do with the fact that we don't know what happens to businesses. So that's a little bit of like the puzzle, the big puzzle that we're trying to put the pieces together and see what's going on, and kind of the assumptions that we're working with when we're looking at all these kind of complex relationships. So this just simply says, you know, the government invests in transit, and that changes the accessibility of the neighborhoods and how they look like. And this investment brings private investments in residential and commercial properties. And all these things together attract usually an upper class of residents, which themselves have a higher demand for properties and commercial amenities. And prices can increase, rents can increase, property taxes can increase for both residential and commercial properties. And that may lead to some level of displacement. But this can also impact the commercial side because when you have a new kind of residents coming into a neighborhood, they don't have the needs and the preferences of the old residents, and they may not want to use the commercial establishments that are already there. And so there is an attraction of other types of businesses in the area, which compete with existing businesses. And so we may see a lot of impacts on businesses as well. So that's kind of a collection of the hypotheses we have for this research. So the title of the presentation is about spatiotemporal impacts, and I want to show a little bit about the different ways that we have looked into impacts in space and time. And I'm going to start with where the story actually starts, with shortly discussing the changes in property prices and how we studied them to see differences over space and time. As I said before, a lot of this research has been going on in this area, but actually most of the studies did not look at what I call an impact. They looked at how prices change with distance from stations, which is not really the impact. And I will explain what I mean in a second. So in this study, we wanted to demonstrate a method where we see what is the spatial distribution of effects on residential properties around stations at different distances from stations. What is the temporal distribution and spanning from the announcement of the project to short-term and long-term operation, and also whether the spatial distribution of impacts changes over time. And that brings us to the spatiotemporal impact that I was mentioning before. So in the research that I'm discussing today, I want to talk about what I call an impact in my work. There is two main things that need to come together to be able to reach a conclusion of whether something caused something else. And that is, we need to look at things over time. We need to do a before and after analysis. That's the one component. The second component is we need a comparison area. We cannot just be looking at the neighborhoods close to light rail stations and be making conclusions based on that. A lot of things change over time, the local economy, the regional economy, the national economy. So we need to be able to remove the effect of that. And the way we do that is by looking at identifying areas that are comparable and making those comparisons to find the difference. So, so when we are estimating models, we usually do it in a setup that is called difference and differences, that allows us to make comparisons over time, plus including comparison areas, which we call control areas. So I want to explain it actually without the equation and just looking at the figure, because I think it makes more sense. So if this is a dependent variable, which we can call it price or whatever you want to study, and this is time, we're observing two different areas over time. So the bottom line is our comparison area, and the top line is the areas close to light rail stations, which we call them treated areas. Okay, so the treatment being the light rail line. And the terminology is actually borrowed from the medical studies, where they give a pill to one group and a placebo to another group, and that's why it's like treated and control. So we use the same terminology here. And so the assumption is that if the light rail had not been built, these two areas would be evolving along similar paths over time. So prices would be increasing or decreasing or staying the same in the same way for these two areas. But now, because of the light rail, there is a change. There is an additional change. And that alpha here is really the impact, okay? And as you can see, the total change is much higher than alpha, but it's the same change that my comparison area is facing. So I remove that and adjust it with that additional, okay? So that is really what we call the impact. And so whether I'm estimating a model or whether I'm simply looking at averages before and after, I always do it, you'll see in this presentation as well, I always do it with a comparison group as well to be able to see if something really changed due to light rail and investments. So, so that's the very, very basic model, but what we're doing in a lot of this research is we include a lot of different treatments. We break our treated area into a lot of different pieces and we studied them separately. So we don't have to worry about the equation, but basically we're expanding the basic model to look at multiple areas and also multiple time periods. How we identify good comparison areas, control groups, sometimes we look at areas that they have been put as potential areas for future lines, but those lines are not officially announced because they will probably be sharing some similar characteristics with areas that were selected for transit corridors, or we look at kind of larger buffer areas around transit because of proximity, there will be similarities. And sometimes we're using something called propensity score matching, which just matches based on some observable characteristics, matches the neighborhoods where the light rail went through with other neighborhoods within our study area. Okay, so there are many ways to find appropriate comparison groups. So the first study I'm going to talk about has to do with Charlotte. And Charlotte, in 2007, they got their first light rail line. And then later, in about 2017, the extension of that line opened. So the blue is the extension that opened 10 years after the red, what I'm showing red here. So in this study, we had two control groups, and the reason we did that is because we want to test our results for robustness. So we're estimating models with one control group, and then we're estimating the same models with another. And we do that to check if results are going to be different. And I'm just showing you a screenshot of the results really, but my point is that beyond the difference in differences setup, we include a lot of other variables to control for all the other things going on. If you look at here, and probably you can't see it, but you see there is a lot of, starting from here, which is the downtown, and we always exclude the downtown from our analysis because there is no place like the downtown anywhere else in that metropolitan area, and we cannot find a group that can really compare to the downtown. So we exclude it. But if you see here, these are pretty dense neighborhoods, and here the density goes down, and the same on this line, you'll see some denser neighborhoods and some much more suburban, lower density areas. So we have to control for these things, right? So a lot of other variables included, and since it's a study about property prices, a lot of residential property characteristics, number of bedrooms, number of bedrooms, and so on are included as independent variables. So I want to just start by showing you the average temporal distribution without considering really space here. And looking at the first portion, the first line of the light rail in Charlotte and looking at how this is really the impact which we can translate as a percentage change. So 0.10 is approximately a 10% increase in price. And the band you see is the 95% confidence intervals. So as long as this doesn't touch our 0, we have statistically significant results. And you will see how basically there's a small impact at the beginning, and as time goes by from construction to short-term to long-term operation, this fluctuates a little bit, but stays at about between 5 and 10% on average. But when we look at things in space, and again, space and time, starting from after the line is announced, during the construction, the short-term and the long-term operation, and looking at distance from the station in miles, we will see that these impacts are not the same, obviously, across the 1 mile area around stations, but the highest impact seems to appear between the 1/4 and the 1/2 mile. And these are single family homes. And the curvature, right, of the impact is increasing over time and reaching about that 20% increase we're here about 10 years after that line opened. A very different story for the extension, the second line that opened in Charlotte, which did not really see any positive impacts until the line opened in 2017. And you may be asking, why is that? These areas were actually very different, and I want to show. Okay, let's look at that for a second. Again, over time and space, the impacts being only significant pretty much between the 1/4 and the 0.75 miles, and that only after the line began operating. So we put this in 3D, and I want to just stay here for a second and say, we thought a lot about why the impacts are so different. It's the same city. It turns out, at least our conclusion, was that the initial conditions in one area versus the other area were very different. So in the original line, the first line that opened, there was the areas around it were much less developed. There was an industrial hub and some single family houses, but less developed compared to the extension of the line, which went through some commercial areas, some industrial areas, and just more developed areas. Also, this being the first slide, there was a lot of kind of like development frenzy where it was this new innovative thing that happened in Charlotte and light rail, and the developers jumped. A lot of national developers also appeared and wanted to take part in developing that area around stations. So we think that's why we see these differences. So that's the first part of the puzzle, how property prices are changing. And then the second part of the puzzle is the neighborhoods around them changing too. And so that's kind of a definition of gentrification that I usually work with, transforming a vacant area or kind of a working class, lower income area into an upper class area. And in the study of gentrification, traditionally, people use some sort of census data, and they're looking at net changes. What I'm trying to say is that they're looking at variables. I think I have that. They're looking at, a lot of times, educational attainment is the #1 variable in gentrification studies, median household income, occupation, types, whether these areas are becoming more, they have more professionals or specific types of occupation. Some studies look at race, and some studies also bring house prices into the mix of things they're studying. But the majority of studies don't just look at one indicator, because gentrification can take different forms in different areas, and you don't tell the story when you're just looking at one thing. So so looking at these variables from census, right, we can say income increased in that neighborhood. But that's a net change that we observe. We don't know if income increased because a lot of high income people moved in, and we don't know if income increased because a lot of low income people moved out, or both. Okay, so that's the limitation of using census data. So I'm gonna first show you this studies we did using census data, and then I'm gonna show some of the other work we've done with more interesting data sets that are kind of newer. So in the study of gentrification, a big question we had in mind was, and again, that kind of has a spatial component to it. I know you guys are all interested in that, so I wanted to bring that up here. Is okay, so we know neighborhoods are interconnected. If something happens in one neighborhood, it will probably influence other neighborhoods as well. So how can something that starts because public transportation triggered it can potentially spill over to other areas that are not really very close to transit? That was our research question here. And that's a question that was answered with some work that my co-advisor, Raymond Florex, the guy I took the spatial econometrics with, course with, he developed, and I worked on that as part of my dissertation. So as I said, the hypothesis is that if transit stimulates gentrification, it's possible that it jumpstarts a self-reinforcing process, a process of neighborhood change that does not stay within the proximity zone that we set as transit is going to just impact this area, but it may also spill over locally to other neighborhoods. The way we are incorporating that into our analysis is, first, we defined which neighborhoods are going to be directly affected, which neighborhoods are close to, we consider them as close to transit, and then which are the neighbors of those areas. And we use, potentially you have heard that before, a spatial weights matrix to define relationships in space. Who is neighbor with who? Okay. So you can say you're my neighbor because you are within 50 meters from me, or you can say you're my neighbor because you are right next to me, okay? Or you touch my border, so that makes you my neighbor. And so that way we can identify impacts that are direct. So the station had an impact on neighborhoods, but we can also identify impacts that are indirect, and in those areas where I am impacted because my neighbor got directly impacted. Okay. So we are incorporating here this weights matrix that defines who is neighbors with who, and this term here, WD, shows the share of somebody's neighbors that are directly close to a station. This method, I applied it in Denver. Denver had a few lines. The first one opened in 1994, yes, and then that's the red dots, and then the green dots opened between 2000 and 2006. So this was kind of a hard thing to study because there were multiple lines opened at different points in time. And another challenging part was that there were areas of overlap. So some neighborhoods were close to the original line, and then when the other stations were built, those neighborhoods found themselves close to the other stations as well. So did I say that? I think I got confused. So some neighborhoods were next to the original stations in 1994, and then a few years later, in the same neighborhoods, these other stations opened, and they were so that these neighborhoods were found themselves close to the original stations and the later stations. Okay, so we wondered if those areas of overlap that you see them with hatch here got extra impacts, so extra affected. So we wanted to study that, and we also wanted to see if there are, so you may have heard in other spatial econometric models, the errors being autocorrelated, so spatial error models. So we did that as well. We had a spatial error model to account for spatial unobserved heterogeneity and correlated residuals that create some issues with the standard errors in estimation. Okay, so what are the results from just our work from Denver and really what this indirect and direct impacts are trying to say? So I'm here having a plot of the model results. I'm always trying to find ways to create figures of model results because I think they're nice, they make more sense. And in this one, you can see the treatment effect, and this is a plot about income. So this is percentage change in income, really. And then at the bottom, you see it says percentage of neighbors that are directly treated. It means they are within a mile from a station. So we call those within the original proximity zone. And if you look at the figures, the lines, you will see, again, confidence intervals with the dotted lines. But you will see that the impact is increasing as the proportion of neighbors being treated increases. What does this really mean? This means that the closer, when you are right next to the station and you're surrounded by also neighborhoods that are also close to the station, that's where the impact is highest, okay? But as you're moving away from the station and when you're hitting areas where you're kind of at the border of, I'm close to the station, but these people here are not really close to the station. So a part of me faces a neighborhood that is not close to a station. So I'm in that border, then the impacts are the lowest, okay? But overall, even forgetting about the spatial spillover effects, the finding of the study was that we saw the highest impacts in those areas where the two lines overlapped, or the stations basically, the impact area of the stations overlapped. Those were the most affected areas. And then next was the red stations. That was the initial line, because that line went through a part of the downtown that was the lowest income area. Okay, they were also the areas that were close to what we call walk and ride stations, so more urban setting, not the type of stations that have, you know, more suburban areas, parking lots. So these were the areas where we saw the highest impact. And although we try in every analysis we do to account for other things that happen in the area or the local context, we can never really remove the local context from the differences we see in the impacts. And that's why we see these differences, okay? So we always try to think, okay, why are the results varying from one area to the other? And it always comes down to the context is different. These neighborhoods are different. They had the different propensity to grow or change. And so we decided to make that kind of the center of the analysis and see really how does the original conditions of an area play a role in the outcomes that this area will experience after an intervention in transportation takes place. So we did that for Charlotte. We wanted, again, to see the initial socioeconomic characteristics of neighborhoods around stations. How are those maybe playing a role in the gentrification outcomes that will happen later? So the way we classified neighborhoods was through a socioeconomic index. And it turns out there's a lot of these indices out there, but they use a lot of the same indicators to come up with these indices to to basically split neighborhoods into neighborhoods of low socioeconomic index, medium, and high. So again, we did this for Charlotte. We focused on the original line. That is not the extension opened in 2018, so we don't have a lot of data, census data after the extension opened to be able to study this. Or at least when the study happened, we didn't have a lot. And so I want to show kind of a close-up of the area around stations. And these are block groups, census block groups that their centroid is within 1 kilometer of a station. So the colors are green for low socioeconomic index, yellow for medium socioeconomic index, and purple for high. And we did not split those equally. That's why you see many more on the medium and fewer on the high. That's based on the income distribution of the region, okay? And we've had a few issues by doing that. First of all, the block groups are not that many and they're pretty big, so that doesn't give us a lot of data to work with, number one. We only have a couple on the high income end, and that also creates an issue when we're trying to estimate separate impacts for the different kinds of neighborhoods. And oh, yes, and the other issue was that you see there's some sorting going on, okay? It's not like there's a random distribution of low, medium, and high socioeconomics in this index neighborhoods. And that does not make us very comfortable here because the low neighborhoods are the closest to the city center, okay? And I will bring that up a little later. So again, we're expanding the basic model to include more treated areas and more time periods. And we're looking at 4 variables. We looked at education, income, race, professional occupation, and property prices, 5. So these plots, again, are showing treatment effects, and you'll see a lot of them touching the 0 line and being insignificant. But what I wanted to point is that we used our model. I talked about the parallel trends in the assumptions of the model, how the control area and the treated areas are assumed to be going parallel before the intervention actually happened. That we can test that through that happens. We can test that through the model, through the econometric model, how we estimate an impact before the line is constructed. And if it's 0, it means there is no impact, which means the trends were parallel, which means our assumption holds. Okay, so we use these plots also to demonstrate that we're not violating the model assumptions. I want to show a little bit, and you probably cannot see this, but I will show this in a different way as well. Just to say a few things. So this is a summary of the results for low, medium, and high socioeconomic index neighborhoods. And we translated, so the educational attainment, professional occupation changes, and percent non-white translate as a percentage point change, household income and house price as a percent change. And two things happened. So the main result is that the biggest changes happened in the low socioeconomic index neighborhoods, number one. The medium socioeconomic index neighborhoods did not see a lot of neighborhood change. And for the high, we could only really satisfy the model assumptions for parallel trends for educational attainment, which we saw substantial changes, but for everything else, we really couldn't say. Okay, so that's why you see the dashes here. Because of having so few neighborhoods on the high side, we had trouble with being able to have estimates that satisfy the model assumptions. And so that is something we couldn't observe, but we were also not very stressed out about the high socioeconomics index neighborhoods in general. So we didn't cry too much that we couldn't say what happened there. But we could definitely say with a lot of certainty that a lot of big changes, some of these percentage changes are at 99, over 100%, 70, 60% over time in income, house prices, educational attainment, and big evidence of gentrifying neighborhoods there. And the way we plotted these results, we plotted them in space. Here, for example, you can see income in 2010, an increase in income, and the increase in income in 2016. And you will see that this part is white because this is the medium index neighborhoods where there wasn't much, the changes were insignificant. So there was no statistically significant change there. The issue, I think, remains that because of sorting of income in pretty much everywhere, right? Again, there is no random distribution of neighborhoods, like somebody threw randomly medium, high, and low income neighborhoods in the map. It's very hard to say that this was definitely not because these happen to be close to the city center, while these ones are kind of further away from the city center. And a lot of the transit-oriented development happened here. But that also is not unrelated to the types of neighborhoods that were here. Because number one, these areas were less developed. And number two, the residents of lower socioeconomic index neighborhoods, when they do have a voice and they can express their concerns about the changes in the neighborhoods, but most of the times they're not heard. And we looked at studies that have explored that, and that's what those studies said. So it's much more likely that a lot of development will happen in areas that are of lower income, and that's because of who is heard and who is not heard when those changes happen. You guys haven't asked any questions. Are there any questions until what we've been discussing now? Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that they're not speaking up. I'm saying that they're not listened to. And yeah, I was, about a year ago, I was in some hearings about the bus rapid transit in Raleigh, and a lot of people were speaking up. And what the Raleigh planners were showing and saying, it was like, I could not believe the things that they were said in that meeting, really disregarding all the research, just selecting the very few studies that showed things towards the direction they wanted to go. And it was just, I was sitting there with like wanting to pull my hair. So yeah. But as I said, in gentrification studies that look at census data, there is not a lot we can say about who came and who left. So we started wondering about that, and we realized that we have access through NC State in data collected by market research companies. Data Axle is the one that we have through NC State, where they provide data that cover the majority of households. They say it's every household in the country, or at least that's what they're trying to achieve, every household in the country, and where that household lives, and if they move, where they move. And so they have address for its household, but they also estimate a lot of things about that household, like income, and are they married or not, and how long they've lived there, and do they have kids. And these are estimates, and we don't, it's from proprietary models that they have, so I can never assess really, are these good estimates or not. But that's what we have, and it's great that we have access to this, because this is really expensive data to get as an individual researcher if you want to do something. And so with that, we looked at migration rates around station areas in comparison to control areas, and we also looked at the probability of a household moving out of those station areas after light rail begins operating. And I want to, because we need a little bit of time for questions, so I just want to say a few things about our findings. There's a lot of in and out migration going on around stations. It's higher overall compared to the control areas we use, and we compared with 2 control areas. There is net migration for sure. More people move in than people move out. That's for Charlotte, okay? Not every transit area in the country. For Charlotte, the households that move in, there are primarily lower income, younger, and not married and without kids. And something interesting we saw for the extension, the second line in Charlotte, was a decrease in the proportion of low-income households. Initially, the station areas were about 73% low income. They went to 56% low income after the line began operating. But this data enables us to see why, or where is that coming from. And something we saw, it was not disproportionate exits of low-income households, but a higher number of middle-income households moving in those areas that really changed that demographic. So we're still working on that, but our results are showing that actually the probability of a household exiting those areas is dropping after the light rail begins operating. And when we see a higher probability of exits, in some cases, they are more for higher and medium income households, and they have never been for the low income households. So that was kind of an interesting result for Charlotte. We were not able to identify any disproportionate risk of leaving for low income households. Okay, so I want to stop here. This is a topic that is related, is moving from residential gentrification to commercial gentrification. I want to see if you guys have questions, and if not, I can say a little bit about this, but yeah.
Yeah, so we do have a microphone to pass around for the benefit of those online. And anyone online, you could put your question in the chat or raise your hand.
Have you considered rezoning or affordable housing initiatives,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you're looking at those effects that, drive income changes? And where I'm going with all of this is, are you looking into social mobility and how transit becomes a factor that may play a role or prevent social mobility, which would be the opposite side of gentrification, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the question is always, does transit play a factor in either the changes that are happening in the neighborhood or the migration patterns that we see? So that's always the question. What is the role of transit? We are looking at the overall changes happen, but we also want to really identify, was it transit that caused that? And not just transit, but also the transit-oriented development that is going on, because we cannot separate the two. Or is this just because the economy is causing a lot of shuffling in the area? So that is always the question. Now, about affordable housing, affordable housing in general being built, we haven't looked at the how each city is building affordable housing irrelevant to transit, but specifically for transit, because a lot of this has been about Charlotte. Shouldn't say that. Oh my God. Charlotte hasn't built any affordable housing close to transit, like pretty much zero. So it wasn't really a factor for the studies related to Charlotte. Denver started building a lot of affordable housing close to transit. So specifically targeting station areas, lots and lots of income restricted units and forcing developers to build there. That's not something that we, at the time that we were studying gentrification there, that's not something that we captured, but it also wasn't something, it's not something that you can capture when you're using census data, because the block groups are so big.
Sure.
And these are kind of net changes we're looking. But yeah, when in studies that use this data axle kind of micro data, it's important if there is affordable housing development going on to be captured. Yeah, that's a great point.
I can pass the mic.
Thanks. Hey, thanks. I guess maybe kind of a general question. I don't think many people in this room are engineers, and this work is really cool and really modeling based. How do you see your work fitting into civil and construction engineering in general? Since I guess this isn't maybe what I would have necessarily expected, what the type of work associated with that kind of engineering.
Yeah.
And like, what is, I guess, like, yeah, is it well received in your field of study? How do you view your work in the field of study?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think overall it has been well received. I don't think it would have been well received some decades ago, but a lot of us in engineering now, we have begun recognizing, realizing we're building things where people live. We really have to care about all these things, not just is this building going to stand, but who is it going to benefit and how is it going to be perceived and who is using it and why. And so a lot of us actually, yeah, I am maybe, you could say, an extreme of an engineer who is studying a lot of, like, my focus is on the impact instead of what would somebody think the engineering. But so many of the engineering professors, not just at NC State, but in general, they have broadened their scope finally, and they're considering impacts of infrastructure. Yeah, a lot.
Cool.
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned that you went to the Raleigh bus rapid transit meetings.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, when you were studying Charlotte, were you working with the city planning commission or like local government? Like, how does your work fit into the policy space in these communities?
Yes, so we did a lot of work in the topic of the Charlotte Light Rail, because that's the only light rail in North Carolina, and a lot of this work has been funded by NCDOT, the Department of Transportation in North Carolina. And we worked with some colleagues from UNC Charlotte, who looked at some other aspects of this kind of puzzle. We didn't put all the effort that maybe we should have to go and speak with a lot of the planners in Charlotte. At the time, it was the pandemic. This was kind of wrapping up around that time, and a lot of personal other stuff going on that I think, yeah, you're right. We could have done a lot more engagement with Charlotte explaining this. At the same time, I think they know, and their attitude has not been very positive to these things. And some of the policies they have put out there just didn't lead to pretty much essentially zero change, zero affordable housing being built in the area. And it's not like they don't know. I think at this age and era, there's no such thing, I don't know. There's conferences, there's places where planners get together, and all they talk about is how we can mitigate the negative consequences of such developments around transit stations, where we really have to keep the people who really need to use transit to keep them there. They know 100%, and they decide not to do much. So yeah, the same with what's going on with bus rapid transit. I also felt very guilty that I didn't speak in those meetings because I was 9 months pregnant, and I was there thinking, oh my God, really, I really have to say something, I really have to do something, but I'm getting ready to go into labor. So yeah. Yeah, it was mind-blowing to see, again, people that perfectly know, put out their plans, well, discuss the research that is really the outliers of all the research, and then talk about how affordable housing is going to help with displacement, which the two are not really related. I'm sorry, but building new units is not going to help you keep the existing residents in their homes, help them with the rents, help them with their property taxes that are going up. And only talking about affordable housing in the form of incentives, and not really, we will make the developers build affordable housing, but only the developers could build affordable housing if they want to get this extra floor or whatever, which they will not do because it's so hard to really find funding for affordable housing. And there's very few developers that have the knowledge to deal with that. So yeah, yes.
It makes me wonder. If you think the state of the research is such that you can do more community engagement and then also more policy work, so that a group, a collaboration can help you with the message, because it looks like you have that narrative, the technical narrative down and all the evidence. And as you said, people know this. It makes me wonder if you would be interested, or if you think the research is ready to do that community engagement, empower people to advocate for themselves, to know the language to use, to really understand. And at the same time, do the work with maybe policymakers, figure out maybe social scientists can help to move that message forward.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely something I want to do. And yeah, sometimes it takes, to build the research to have enough to be able to convince, and have the time to invest to doing also something that is very important. One thing that happened, and it made me very happy, was that in Denver, where I did a lot of my studies and surveys about how people who live right next to transit in the fancy houses and apartments, how they travel versus those that live in income restricted houses. And it was very obvious that the majority of those in income restricted houses, they take transit and they support the ridership, right? And they make transit continuing to be financially sustainable partially. But then the ones in the market rate properties, the new apartments built through transit-oriented development, not using transit. And again, Denver being a city that has built a lot of affordable housing, but the transit agency somehow being very conservative in ways about how they develop their properties around transit. But through all the research, they finally listened. And I did have a very passionate person, John Hersey, working there, who was carrying my message through that transit agency. And eventually they made an affordable housing policy about the areas that they owned around stations. And that made me so happy. It's like something good came out of all this. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're at time, we're past time. Let's have a final round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks everyone for coming. If you have any suggestions for improving our experiment and using this new space, please feel free to forward them. Things went really well. Did you hear in the back? Well, okay, good. Turn off printers. Shut doors.
And there are refreshments afterwards too.
Please feel free to